All right, welcome to our lecture on kings. You should have just watched that Google Earth video that recapped everything we've been talking about so far, from Moses to Joshua, Joshua invading the Promised Land and then being ruled by the judges. And now we're talking about the kings. Let's go for it. All right, so here I have a timeline from a picture of the back of the Bible that we have in class. I know you're missing those hard copy Bibles. Don't worry, they're there waiting for you. But let's get real fancy here and try and get my red pointer out. Woohoo! Okay, so with this pointer, we can see that here we have bring it back. Here we have biblical prehistory. These are all the stories from Genesis that are prehistory, like Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel, and Noah. And then around 1850 BC, you can see here, 1850 BC, we get our first patriarch and matriarch. That's Abraham and Sarah. And then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob last about 100 years. So you can see 1850 to 1750 are those first three patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. And then we mosey on down over here to Moses. Moses and his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam. They lead the Exodus out of Egypt around 1290 BC. So now we're moving on to 1290 BC right here. And right after Moses escapes Egypt, then Joshua takes over, and Joshua makes that final push into the Promised Land. And you can see that happens here in 1250 BC. And that's what we were just talking about in the video before this with Google Earth, how Joshua invaded the Promised Land. That takes place in 1250 BC. And if you were paying super close attention to that video, you know that right after Joshua is the era of the judges. And those judges are those superheroes who protect the Israelites, and that takes place around 1200 BC and lasts for about 200 years. And then eventually, the Israelites go, you know what, we want a king. These judges are great and all, but we want a solid king. And so they name their first king, and that happens in 1020 BC, and that is Saul. So I'll underline his name right here. We get Saul, the first king. And Saul doesn't work out too well, and so we get our second king, which is David. And he is our second king and our most famous king in the Bible. And the thing I like about David, there's lots of things I like about David, but one thing that makes it really easy to remember when David took place is that he unites the kingdoms, becomes king in the year 1000 BC, which is a super easy date to remember. 1000 BC is when David takes the reign. So the most famous king in the Bible takes his reign in 1000 BC, making it much easier for students like you to remember David, because it's such an easy number. And then in 961, his son Solomon takes over. So these are the first three kings: Saul, David, and Solomon. And then we're going to stop right there for this PowerPoint. Let's keep going. So a call for a king. Why did the Israelites want a king? Well, after the time of the judges, those superheroes, they wanted some central leadership. They wanted, to be like other nations, to have one ruler, and so they wanted a king. They were concerned that all these 12 tribes would divide, that if they didn't have central leadership, that they divide up, and that other nations would overthrow them, and they wouldn't be as powerful if they were just a bunch of groups as opposed to one unified nation. So they wanted a king. So a guy named Samuel, which is this guy right here, Samuel, he's the last judge of that previous era, and he's the first prophet of Israel. And so Samuel, as the last judge and the first prophet, is the one who anoints the kings of Israel. An anointing is this right here. He's anointing the kings with oil, and that's what he uses to, christen them, make them a king. And he's able to do that because he is a prophet for Israel. So he anoints the kings. So let's talk about the second king of Israel, King David, the one who was anointed in 1000 BC. Here you can see him, he's rocking out on the lyre, L-Y-R-E, which is a kind of harp. And David, he's the second king of Israel. He's a successful military leader. He's a gifted musician. He's a savvy politician. He's a charismatic guy. He's a popular dude. He's strong and good at music, so he does very well with the ladies, as we'll see. And he does one thing that no other king is able to do. He unites the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel. He's the only guy who was able to unite all of the Israelites, and that's what makes him very, very famous in the Bible. When David followed the will of God, he was able to do great things, just like every other person we've met in the Bible. If you follow God, good things happen. But David was a flawed man as well. David sinned a lot, and that sin made it hard for him to see what God wanted him to do. Whenever he sinned, though, David returned to the Lord begging for mercy and promising to change. And this is what makes David different from other people in the Bible. Every person in the Bible we've met so far is flawed. They're not perfect people, and David is no different. But the thing that makes David an interesting character and an interesting figure in the Bible is that whenever he messes up, and oh boy does he, man, he makes some crazy, terrible mistakes, which we'll get into. But whenever he does that, he returns to the Lord saying, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." And that's what makes him a redeemable character. So let's see David as a model for servant leadership. Here we have two kind of contradictory words. We have servant and leader, which sound like opposite things. So let's see how they actually um, relate to each other. So despite David's sin and faults, he calls to God, beckons to God to raise him up from abyss so that he can rule with a just heart and a serving hand. Here we see David, he's surrounded by darkness. That represents his sin, but you can see he's pleading and begging to God that he can serve with a just heart and a serving hand. Servant leaders, this idea of servant leader, what makes them so special is that they recognize their own need for forgiveness and reconciliation, and in return, they can extend that mercy and compassion to all. So let's think about that with David. Because David realized that he was so sinful. See, he's like looking down, he's humble, he knows he's surrounded by the darkness of sin here. Because he realizes, oh, I'm an imperfect person, I need forgiveness. Then, when his servants and his subjects and the people he's ruling mess up, he can go, oh, they're imperfect too, and I should forgive them just as God forgave me. So David realizes he needs forgiveness from God. Then David is able to extend that same forgiveness to his people. And that's what makes him a servant leader, is that he realizes that he should forgive those that he rules.